Now let's talk about why we even care about supply chain. Because we've talked about why it's hard, what the challenges are, what it actually is, but why are we spending the time? Why are you spending the time trying to learn more about supply chain management? So why do we care? Well, supply chains have grown. They span the globe and they can no longer be managed as an isolated function. Companies are finding that they can't manage their warehousing separate from their inventory, separate from their transportation, separate from demand planning, and from procurement. You need to look at them all collectively. It's not an isolated function anymore. It spans the globe. It's the piece that ties everything together. It's become critical for almost any company's operations, and it's the one function that connects the different functions, divisions, and business units within a firm, as well as across from firms. So pretty much what's happened is supply chain management has evolved, and it's evolved into being both a bridge and a shock absorber. By a bridge, and this is a picture of the Zakim Bridge in Boston, and is that supply chain is the only function that really covers from suppliers all the way to customers. It crosses all the boundaries. It is the organization's main way to deal with suppliers and to handle customers and to manage the product and coordination of flow between those. It's also a shock absorber. So when something outside the company changes, the supply chain management role is to adapt and be flexible and to adjust so that the company can continue to operate. So there's a lot of things that can happen, these external factors that can impact, and it's the supply chain's job to be the shock absorber for the company and to be able to keep that company operating. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a classic example. This is the variability of number 2 diesel fuel in the United States. And on the horizontal axis is just times, and I go back to 2006 up until earlier this summer. And on the vertical axis is the price in dollars per gallon of number 2 diesel. That's the most common fuel used for truckload and less than truckload trucking. And so what I show here in this dark line, this dark solid line, is the actual price of fuel. And you can see what happened in the summer of 2008. The price of fuel went up to about $4.76 a gallon, up from less than $3, about $2.60, peaked to that within about a year, and then dropped again. So think of all that variability, and the supply chain's function, along with transportation, logistics, inventory management, is how do you change your operations to keep the company functioning, to make sure that your costs are remaining low and your service is remaining high. So you've got to be able to handle these kind of disruptions. You can look at disruptions like this in terms of other commodity prices, in many other different factors, but fuel is a predominant one. And just as an aside, what I also show are these little dotted lines. So here's one, and each of these is the prediction, or the forecast rather, made by the Energy Information Administration at January of that year of what the price of fuel will be over the next 24 months. And I put this in here not to make that organization look bad, because predicting or forecasting fuel is very difficult, is to show that in a lot of cases, predicting or the uncertainty of this underlying input, the fuel, is next to impossible. Forecasting is almost impossible. So you look at some of these and you see how far off the forecasts are even immediately. And now you might say, well, maybe we're getting better because look at here in the more recent. And that's just because we're hitting a stable period. And so the reason why I bring this up is because that whole idea of uncertainty and variability, it's happening. It's happening in your inputs. It's happening in your demand by your products. It's happening for your manufacturing processes. And your job as a supply chain management professional is to be able to handle these peaks and these valleys, to come up with a solution that'll be able to make your company be successful. Because as you will learn through this course, if I told you what the price of fuel is going to be up here for the rest of the next 10 years, you could design a supply chain that would work perfectly for that. If I told you the price of fuel will be down here, you could do the same thing. It'd be a different supply chain, but you could optimize to that price of fuel. The problem is that the price of fuel fluctuates. And so how do you come up with a supply chain that's able to handle all of those? And that's why your supply chain needs to be a shock absorber. And those are some of the skills you'll learn in this class. Why else do we care? Well, supply chain is massive. So what I'm showing here is years from 1980 up until 2013. And on the vertical axis is the percentage of the GDP, of the United States gross domestic product. And what I'm showing here is the inventory cost as a percentage of GDP. So it's a large amount, right? So it's $470 billion in 2013, but it used to be 8% of GDP in the early 1980s, and now it's just about 3%. Same thing for transportation costs. It's gone way down as around a 7%, and it's decreased down to around 5%. So collectively, logistics costs have gone down from right around 16% to about 8%. So while GDP has gone up by about 5x, we've seen that supply chain has only gone up by a much smaller amount, by only 2x for inventory holding costs and less than 4x for transportation costs. So 2 points here. One is logistics and supply chain is a big part of the economy. Collectively, it's about $1.2 trillion. But because it's been efficiently managed over the last 30 years, it's really come down as a percentage of GDP. So we're shipping more, we're moving more product, but we're doing it much, much more efficiently. But this brings to the last reason why supply chain is so interesting to focus on. Because the idea is what got us here over the last 30 years might not be the thing that gets us going forward. Just because we got here by being efficient and managing lower costs doesn't mean that's going to be successful going forward. It's because supply chain management is an emerging and evolving function. What do I mean by that? Well, remember how I talked about the Council of Supply Chain Management and how it was originally called the National Council of Physical Distribution, back when it was considered a functional role. And then it became the Council of Logistics Management. And now it's the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. Well, along with the organizations, the whole approach to supply chain management has evolved. And it's moved from individual isolated functional activities to these coordinated supply chain activities. So maybe the type of skills that got us here might not be the ones that take us to be successful the next 10, 15, 20 years. So here's a chart that kind of fleshes this out a little more. If I look at the key skills, what was critical was to be a technical expert in a narrow field, whether it's transportation, warehouse design, forecasting. That was the critical thing, to be an expert in your function. Now the key skill is really being able to coordinate between those functions. The type of influence that you would give, you'd be within your siloed function and you needed to have it local and you'd control. The leadership style you would use would be hierarchical, direct, kind of the hard leadership skills, telling people what to do, performance level, make sure they did what they were supposed to do. Now you've got a challenge because your influence is across the entire supply chain. You can't necessarily tell your customer what to do. You can influence them, so your leadership skill will be different. You have to have indirect or softer skills because how your retailer customer works with you can influence your costs, and how your supplier, what their operations will also influence your costs. So you need to look end to end and be coordinating those things, but it takes a different type of skills, both influence and leadership. Your risk management profile will change. What was once reactionary, now you have to plan that response and be more flexible, be able to be that shock absorber I was talking about. As we talked before, you can't have a single metric anymore for just your silo. It has to be multifaceted and end-to-end, that SCORE model that we talked about. And if you look at technology approaches and platforms, if you talk to anyone who sold software in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, it was all about optimizing that isolated function, whether it was inventory, transportation, network design. It was really focused on that one function. Now the technology is really all about visibility, getting information, sharing information, and coordinating across entities. The platform, instead of being hosted on site, now you have more cloud technology or software as a service, things where it's jointly used. And then finally, the scope has changed from being regional or national, kind of a smaller level, to global and multinational. The big takeaway from this is that supply chain management is growing and it's evolving. It's going from a functional role to something that's much more comprehensive end-to-end, involves many different facets, different types of skills, technically as well as leadership and management. And that's why you should be excited to be studying supply chain management. So, this is the end of the first lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please use the discussion. Don't be shy, and we'll see you next time.